Hey, hey!
Okay, so welcome everyone. This is Promises in Node.js Core. This is going to be, in large, my opinion about events and my personal experience. And a lot of the things I'm going to say here are a little bit controversial technically. So if you disagree with something, then you're welcome to come and tell me at the end, but it is what it is. Cool. So about me, this is just some projects I'm a little bit involved in. There's MobX for React client side. There's Bluebird, which we'll go into later, and also Node. Those of you who know RX, reactive extensions, this is also like projects I'm involved in. And this is Bimper, my dog. He's really cute, and he's dressed like the bee. Okay, so here's a short overview of what we'll do today. We're going to talk about a little bit about promises, a little bit about how promises evolved in JavaScript and in general, and we're going to talk about async await just a little bit because I think a lot of you are already familiar with it. We're going to talk about promises in Node. We're going to talk about problems with promises, which is actually not something I've ever presented, and that's pretty much it. We're going to talk about the future, hopefully, and maybe about how you can help Node. Okay, so first of all, who here knows how to use promises or have used promises before? Wow, that's great. Okay, so when people start telling me, okay, who here uses promises as the primary asynchronous primitive of choice, that is more promises than callbacks? Oh, that's still not great. Okay, fun stuff. So we're going to cover promises just really quickly so we can get everyone at the same level. And then we're going to talk about more advanced stuff. So promises. So one common mistake people have with promises is that they'd ask, I have a list of promises, how do I run them like 4 at a time? And that's because the most common misconception I know about promises is that people think of them like as actions, where a promise is just like a value that has a time bound to it. So it's just something we got that we might want to extract in the future. So it's a value of time and a time, and it's not an action, it's just a result. So you can't like run promises. So promise is already value. You already ran the function, that's how you got the promise in the first place. And a promise is something called monadic. Those of you who've done functional programming are probably like cringing at it right now. But basically, then on a promise, it has the signature of bind on a monad, because it can unwrap values, and we'll see this really soon. Promises are pretty much like a very simple state machine. They start off as pending. That means the promise has started, or and we're not sure if the operation is successful or failure. And then it undergoes resolution, which can mean several things. It can mean it becomes fulfilled, which means the function it executed successfully. It can become rejected, which means the operation failed, or it can follow another promise, which we'll not go into. And promises are singular. So if you have an event emitter, a promise would not be a good replacement. If you have a stream, a promise would also not be a suitable replacement. Promises are just for the use case where you have a single function that only emits something once. For multiple values, we have async iterators, streams, and observables. And the core idea behind promises in JavaScript is to let us use language primitives like return and throw. If you return from a callback, you just short-circuit the execution. If you didn't call the callback and you did an early return, nothing's going to happen. And then if you throw in a callback, in pretty much most environments I've seen, Node just crashes. And promises let us use return and throw to let the consumer of the API decide which error is important enough to crash the server. And it's pretty nice. So here's how you take one of your callback APIs and convert it to a promise one. So there's this new promise thing that's called the promise constructor. It's actually a really cool pattern called the revealed constructor pattern. And basically, it takes two functions, resolve and reject. Resolve makes the promise succeed, usually, unless we do something quirky with it. And reject makes the promise rejected. Also, if we throw here, the promise also becomes rejected. This is to guard against a timing issue, where if you have a synchronous throw here, a function would either throw synchronously or asynchronously, which would make you do a dot catch and a catch, and it's just not fun. And basically, this is how we turn a function to promises. And actually, there's a cooler way now. This is what you do today, thanks to. We'll get into. No. No. Okay, so this is what you do today. Releasing on May 30th comes Node 8, hopefully. And it exposes a new util.permissify function that lets you just take any Node core callback API and convert it to promises, and we'll get more of that later. But basically, these are the two things you need to know. The promise constructor should only be used for converting APIs to promises. Almost every other use case I've seen of the promise constructor is wrong. There are exceptions, but I just like to give a warning. And if you're turning anything from Node itself to promises or any other Node compatible library, please use util.permissify. It's faster. We'll understand why soon. And then one of the most important parts of promises, like I said, is the fact that you can return from a then another promise, and then you no longer have callback, like nested callbacks or the pyramid of doom. Now, you can write very effective code with callbacks, but I think promises really simplify a lot. If you return from a then it will wait for the promise before processing everything below, and you can throw inside a then handler, which means if you have something that failed, you can use a try catch like you do in any other language, which is really nice. And then it chains, so you can do something, and then something else, and then something else, and you get really nice chains that are flat and not nested, which is super useful with promises. And promises come with built-in tools for aggregation. So if you want to wait for two things, for example, you want to query two different databases, or you want to report to several services, or anything of the sort, you can do promise.all and wait for multiple things, or promise.raise for waiting for the first thing to complete. And again, note that once you've obtained a promise, the operation is already started. You can start a promise. It's another thing to keep in mind. Okay, so here is already using async await in production. So all of you are using async await in production. That's really cool. That's like more than half. So props to you. That's really great to hear. So async await is two keywords. They're relatively new. We've had them since Node 7.4, I think. 7.6. I ran it with the flag. Never mind. Async await is built on top of promises. You need promises to make async await work. And async await is built on top of promises in other languages that have it, like C#, Python, Dart, F#, and many others. And it's still asynchronous. It's still like the Node event loop. There's still like one user thread backed up by like libuv thread pool and the async.io and all that. But it lets us write synchronous code. So here's a much simpler piece of code than what Gil showed. That's because it's really small. So we have delay here. In Node, you can do util.permissify set timeout and get delay that way, or you can write it with promises. It's like a one-line conversion. But you probably should do util.permissify because it's faster. And then you do an async function log. You have to put the keyword async before the function. You have to put the keyword await before promises you want to wait for. And you do a for loop, and this will log 1, and wait a second, then log 2, and wait a second, and so on and so on. Note that this was like Star Trek technology 5 years ago in JavaScript. I don't know how many people here wrote JavaScript like 6, 7 years ago? Wow, also a lot. I have a very positive crowd today, thank you. This was like dreamland a few years ago. We tried several things, like we had fibers, and we had threads for Node at one point, and we had a lot of things that didn't really work as well. I found that converting code to async await really helps readability and reduces bugs. Of course, some people disagree. So basically we now covered what promises are and what async await is. I want to tell you a little bit of an untold story about how promises started in Node and in JavaScript. Okay, so promises are older than JavaScript. People don't realize this. Promises as a concept exists since the 70s and have been implemented in languages since the 80s. As we know them, Barbara Liskov, and that other researcher, I can never like Shrira, I think. Yeah, Luba. Yeah, okay, so I actually spoke to her and I don't know how to pronounce the name, so it's kind of embarrassing. And Mark Miller, independently for the E-programming languages, both discovered the concept of using promises as proxies with pipelining and all sorts of really cool stuff. And That's pretty much how they started many years ago. And since then, many languages have added them. So JavaScript is not alone in having native promises. C# has native promises, so does E, R, Python, Java, with completable future in Java 8, Dart, Scala. Pretty much most modern languages that have to do with concurrency. Absent from this list are languages like Go that have a slightly different model that does something pretty similar. And that's like really an improvement over the past years. So if callbacks were the most common pattern in languages a few years ago, promise adoption has started like across the programming community. So it's not just us getting promises and async awaiting cool stuff. It's actually pretty much programming worldwide. So hopefully we'll have, there's like a proposal for C++ futures. There's already promises and it's really cool. Okay, so Q is the first library. Who here used Q ever? Okay, so the Q library is the one that really popularized promises in Node, I think, because it was Node oriented. It came with tools to work with Node, and Q was pretty great, but it was also kind of slow. Especially back then. Since then, V8 got faster and Q got faster, but Q is kind of slow. And then Bluebird Image, we'll talk about this more. And it's the first library that really had fast promises, as in you can switch your API from callbacks and not worry about performance at all. It was as fast as callbacks and usually faster than callbacks that people hand wrote unless they really understood performance. So it's a lot easier to not take a closure. Everyone here knows what a closure is? Okay, yeah, don't laugh at me, it's a legit question. And so basically, people who are not very intimate with performance would actually write slower callback code than promise code with Bluebird, and that was great. So Node's native promise support is, at least like all the hooks and implementation, are highly inspired by Bluebird, which is based on Q, the first library, which is in turn based on Dojo promises. Anyone here use Dojo? It's getting smaller, great. So Dojo is like a really old UI toolkit, and that actually also inspired jQuery promises. So since I think 1.4 jQuery had broken promises, and they didn't really work, they improved them in 1.8, and they still didn't quite work. And then they fixed them in 3.0. That was the big thing, getting like a compatibility. And then the only reason Dojo had promises is because one of the developers used Python's Twisted before that, and that had deferred. So it's kind of evolved from there. And it's like, I think this was like 7 years ago, 6 years ago, 5 years ago. No, that's like 7 years. Q is 7 years old. I think Bluebird is like 4 years old, and then Node's native promises are like 3 years old, I think, since 0.12. And one of the things that enabled this evolution is the fact that promises were specified. A group of very smart people came and specified promises into standards called Promises A and Promises A+, that enabled libraries like Bluebird to be written, because there was a specification that was not bound either to TC39, the body that specifies JavaScript, or WatWG, the body that specifies most of the DOM. And people actually sat down together as a collaborative effort with no like bigger incentive other than making promises in JavaScript work well, and they wrote two amazing standards with thousands of tests, and that's pretty much what gave us compatibility. You can use Bluebird promises with jQuery deferreds, native promises. You can mix all of them around now, and everything will work as expected. You can use Bluebird in like an async function because Bluebird then conforms to the standard, and that's really important. So the lesson to take from this is that standards and specs matter. If you want to push something, like you feel really strongly about, I don't know, observables or like change detection in certain scenarios, or maybe like a new protocol, by writing a specification of how a client for it should be read, you enable traction and community support. It's very hard to get a community behind something they're not sure about. Okay, so some trivia effect. Node 0.2 had promises, except it didn't understand them. So Chris told me he met Ryan, I think in India, and he told him, yeah, promises are great, you should try promises for Node, and he tried, but he sort of didn't get it. So the promises didn't change, they were like event emitters, and then they were removed from Node because it didn't really work. And promises were removed. So that's like the first time we had native promises in Node. And then in September 2013, I started using promises. I had a hard time understanding them because it's a difficult concept to truly grasp. I think a lot of people can use them without understanding them. And I met a guy called Petka in Stack Overflow chat, and I participated in the chat a lot. I still do, and you get to meet people. And I told him like I'm going to fly to Finland where he lives, and I went to Helsinki for a month, which was really cool. This was 2013, and we met for a few beers a few times, and he was like always ranting like this is broken and this is broken, and I can't believe this Q library, it's so slow, I bet I could do something better. And I told him, yeah, do something better. And like pretty much 2 days after, he came back with like Bluebird 0.4, I think, and we talked about it, and then we're still good friends. I met him in Amsterdam again, and basically he wrote fast promises, and initially they didn't conform to the A+ standard very well, but after that they started conforming, and it was very fast. Now, I want to talk a bit about pushing Bluebird. Like, it's been a real challenge. Trying to tell people to use promises was a little bit like trying to tell them their database query should be implemented in Erlang using a MapReduce 4 years ago, because everyone was like, promises are stupid, and there's a very negative aspect of the JavaScript community sometimes, where they hear of a new concept, and if they're not using it, they will tell you that it's bad just because they're not using it. And like it's a small part of the JavaScript community, and some people genuinely don't like promises, and that's fine. But pushing promises was very hard. I had to answer I told myself that for a year I'm going to answer every single question about promises in Stack Overflow, and I did. I have more than 700 answers, and I started participating in spec discussions and language discussions, and I started pushing for APIs and hooks I needed to make promises usable, because promises had a big problem we're going to discuss, and it was very, very time-consuming. And let's talk a little bit about how that happened in Node, how we had promises. So, since the 0.8 days, we had fast. It's before, but we had since 0.8 we had Bluebird, which enabled fast promises, and Node 0.12 shipped with like spec compliant promises, which was great, and they were very hard sell. They were slow. They were hard to work with initially. Bluebird, following the footsteps of other promise libraries, I think RSVP and When deserve a special shout out for pushing standards, and Bluebird made them debuggable. Now, who here has ever heard that promises swallow errors? That promises swallow errors, promises are hard to debug. Okay, so that was actually true at a point. There was a point where promises did swallow errors, and it was very hard to work with them, because you had a function, you had a typo in the function. Some people don't like TypeScript, like Gil, and like I don't see him. Never mind. And Gil, and you had typos, and the program would silently end, or not even silently end. It would just like. It would just do unpredictable stuff, and promises were very hard to work with then. When I started using Q, it was very hard. So let's say I have an async function, and I edit then because I don't want to do an await here, and I do a read async, and then I look at the result, and I throw an error. Using like native promises from 3 years ago, what would happen here?
Nothing.
Okay, so we had two suggestions here. Either the program would crash or nothing. The answer is nothing. So actually, if you had a node server that did this, you would get like stalled HTTP requests and stuff not working. It was very, very hard to work with promises back then. They'd swallow errors. It would be really annoying. And Petka came up with an idea. He said, no, okay, so let's look at the same problem with callbacks first. So catch handlers to promises can be added at any point. I can do a set time on here and add a catch handler to P after like half a day, and it would be legal promise activity. And this is kind of like the fact I can ignore error parameters in callbacks, except it's also for synchronous values, because promises normalize APIs. They abstract the asynchronicity from you. In Bluebird, Petka came up with an idea. Usually, in like 99.9% of cases, when a promise has an error, people handle it immediately. Either you have a try catch in an async function, or you do a catch almost immediately after you create a promise. You almost never do this silly dance where you add a catch handler to a promise much later. And Bluebird did this when this was really cool. It saved me a lot of time, and it enabled promises for me. It was the reason I started using promises. If you throw an error with Bluebird, you get a nice stack trace. Unhandled rejection error, this is like a long stack trace, by the way. You get everything that ever happened. And it works. And suddenly promises were debuggable, which was cool. And I saw that, and I thought to myself, hey, cool, let's write a specification around it. Let's make sure every promise library behaves well. So I wrote a specification called Unhandled Objection NodeJS Promise Hooks. And basically, in order to get the spec to pass, I had to pretty much bug every single library author who wrote the promise library, and I had to write it myself for Q, and Petka wrote it for Bluebird, and then later Node, and some libraries just went out to implement it, which was really, really cool. And Dominic worked on similar hooks at the same time for browsers, and he really helped me, and I hope I helped him, at least he said so, in the browser hooks. So Node, when I wanted to do this, was it was very good timing because it was just opening up. Node just became IOJS. It was like when the fork happened, which was really cool, because I opened an issue about that in Node. It's called Node Archive now, but Node 0.12, and they just ignored it. And and it was just ignored for a month. And in the meantime, in IOJS, it exploded. We got 400 messages, and this is Petka, by the way. It's a real life picture of him. The fire is real. And pretty much, we worked on it for maybe a month, and it got 400 messages. And it was really long discussions in working groups and all sort of stuff. But we added the event, and promises in Node.js got debuggable. So this was, I think, a very big milestone for promises in Node. Just being able to catch stray errors and not having promises swallow exceptions made all the difference, I think, for adoption. Because when your program does not let you know when an error happened, it's not a very good user experience. And since then, okay. So native promises were slow. They're still kind of slow, and they're getting much better. In the upcoming version of V8, they're actually almost as fast as Bluebird. And that was a big problem because people didn't want to use native promises, which was making me a little sad. In the meantime, Node.js, Bluebird was exploding. Bluebird got to a point where we have 40 million downloads a month, one of the biggest packages in NPM. Dependents include big companies like Google, Facebook. If any of you have ever used WhatsApp Web, it's pretty much, it does a lot of the heavy lifting with Bluebird. And also on the client side, NPM itself uses Bluebird, a lot of different programs. And Bluebird is still very popular, but it's kind of bad when a library that was written 4 years ago is still much faster than the native stuff. So the V8 team really listened, and that's props for them. They did a really good job listening and understanding the problems and working on them. Native promises are going to be fast. I'm actually working on a project. Dor presented it in the Goodness Squad yesterday of making a Bluebird compatible API on top of native promises, and hopefully that becomes as fast as Bluebird. And it releases really soon. I think V8 promises got really fast, but they still had a very, very weak point. When you create a promise, I remind you, those who are still with me from the first slides, you do return new promise, and then you take a function of resolve and reject. That's sort of like closure allocation. The fact I'm creating a closure here, and the fact sometimes stuff needs to escape it, and it's going from C++ to JSLand and back, is actually making converting APIs to promises slow. Now, that's a problem because if you promissify a function, you're going to call it for every request. It's not uncommon for apps to have 100,000 promises at once. And if every operation carries the overhead, the users attempt to take shortcuts. And when the users attempt to take shortcuts, it means the API has a problem. So in order to get promises adopted in Node, they needed to be fast. In order to be fast, we needed a way to create promises. It does not require us to do return new promise, because return new promise, while fast in user apps, is a no-go for library authors. As a library author, performance is a lot more critical to me because I have to keep my overhead minimal. So we had to solve this. And basically, since then, Chris from Node Core made a really big effort to push promises into core. It was met with a very uphill battle. This was last year, and a lot of bike shedding about what API should look like. And it's actually a huge undertaking. It's a lot of it was bike shedding. Those of you who don't know, it's spending time on the details and not the big stuff. But a lot of it was actually legitimate questions about how a promise API would look like in Node, and addressing the issues. And eventually, unfortunately, steam ran out. It pretty much halted to a stop. This was last year. So let's talk about why it stopped. Let's talk about the postmodern problem. It's a problem that people have had with promises for a while. And basically, a common practice, especially for some particular large companies, is whenever there's an error in Node, take a core dump. And basically that means take all the heap and stack and inspect them later. Now, with a promise, you can add a catch handler later than the action. So you don't really know when to take a core dump. And no matter when you take a core dump, it's too late. So this is actually still an open problem because we still don't know how to solve postmodern debugging with promises very well. We take it very seriously, and I have some really nice ideas with schedulers and ways to address this, taking like partial dumps or taking heap dumps and doing them copy and write. There are some ideas of how to solve this, but this is why there is pushback from Node against promises in core, because they genuinely do break the flow of some Node consumers, and that's important. Now, I realize that a lot of you have never done this, but it's very important for Node to not break people's code. It's something Node takes very seriously. And this caused pushback, and we had to find a middle way. On one hand, I wanted users to be able to use promises in Node easily and efficiently, because, like I said, the promise constructor was slowing things down. And on the other, this caused, we need to find a middle ground. And that's where util.permissify came in. So I actually started looking at util.permissify a while back. The idea was to have a standard way to convert callback APIs to promises that's fast and doesn't have the problem with performance, and it works with things like fs.exists and non-standard APIs. And that's something that's been going on for a while. This is me opening a pull request, like opening an issue for util permissify in Node 0.12. It was shut down like very quickly. People told me, yeah, promises are not something we're interested in, and this was before the IOJS days, so they generally weren't interested, and there wasn't a lot I could do about it. Now, this is a pull request for, I think, half a year ago. No, almost a year ago. For edit. What, sorry? Oh, okay, no, I thought you were asking something. So this is a pull request from a few months ago. Not a pull request, the issue, sorry. For editing the same things, but this time in modern Node with the new way of getting changes. And basically the idea was to make, I even called it awaitable. Anyone has any idea why it's called awaitable, not permissify? Okay, so some people here were very optimistic, and they're thinking it's because I await it. I tried to call it awaitable and not permissify in order for some people who don't like promises to not figure out this is promises. It didn't work. It ended up being called permissify, but it ended up working anyway. So this was open for a while, and we had a lot of discussion about how to build this. And then suddenly, like a month ago, Anna picked this up, Anna from NodeCore, and this was amazing. Woo! And this was amazing of her. She pretty much like picked up all my Slack and just wrote a proof of concept, which is amazing. And we had to iterate a lot on it because there were a lot of edge cases and questions about it. And I want to thank Do and Gil here for actually writing commits out of that util permissify, so you can thank them for that function too. So yay them, everyone. So the PR took a lot of time to get ready, and it got reviewed and feedbacked from more than 10 developers, which was great. And eventually, we had to call for a vote because Node has a consensus-seeking process where optimally we'd like everyone to agree. And one person who was pushing against this because of the postmodern concerns, and it got in. It took us a while, and it's coming to Node 8 in my 30s. So that's cool. I want to talk a little bit about the future now. Just a few more minutes. Okay, so I want all APIs in Node to return promises and work with async away. This is something I think we should be able to do. I want performance advantage of native promises on Bluebird by the end of the year, which means I'm very optimistic about like the performance we're going to get. I want to integrate async iterators. Those of you who don't know what those are can watch my talk from last JavaScript Israel, I think. And other construct into Node, and this is work we're already doing with the Streams working group and other working groups. And I want to talk about you and what you can do to help, because all of the things above are not because I'm smart or like a good programmer. It's because I'm annoying. I know how to like pick stuff and that I want and then just like bug people until it happens, and that's a really good skill. And no clapping for that. And I think one of the barriers for writing open source is that people think you need to be like a super 10x developer or something to start doing it, and it's just not the case. Look at me. So Node is what we call an inclusive project. It means that we will actually help you make contributions, and I think Gil and Dor took this opportunity and wrote commits in the last Goodness Squad, but I will personally help each and every one of you who wants to get involved, so let me know. And your help is appreciated. Whatever you can do, like report issues you find. This is super important. A lot of people like run into bugs and then say, this is, I didn't understand it correctly, or this is not a bug or something like that. Report bugs. A lot of people don't, and we really appreciate it when you do. Be kind to people, go to issues, support issues you like to see promoted, and talk to them, and say hi. Go to the NodeJS chat room or the JavaScript chat room in Stack Overflow and start talking to people and being more involved in the community. You're in a meetup now, so you're trying to get more involved, but try and doing that. And you can do a lot of things in Node, like go over pull requests and review them, or read docs and suggest improvements. You don't need to be very like the greatest developer in Node in order to do any of that. You just need to want to help. And if any of you get stuck, again, talk to me. Seriously. Okay, any questions? Yeah.
Developing in Node is more C++ or JavaScript?
Developing in Node is more C++ or JavaScript. Oh, you mean like Node Core? Yes. So you can make significant contributions in whichever you're comfortable with. There is work to be done in C++, and there's work to be done in JavaScript, and there's work to be done that does not require C++ or JavaScript. There's even Python work if you want. Any other questions? Yes, Shaham.
You said for the future you would like to push for Node APIs to return promises. Is that for real, the actual return promises, or they will be promissifiable?
Okay, so the question was about Node promise APIs. So I would like to see Node APIs returning promises. I would definitely not want to see Node APIs that are existing breaking. So in any case, you'd have the option to work with callbacks. But if we look at the pull request from last year, the idea was to convert all APIs to optionally return promises if you omit the last argument or work with it in a specific way. Any other questions? Going once, going twice? Yes, Ben over there.
How was your birthday?
How was my birthday? It was great. Any other questions? Yes?
We have a debate in our company. We're running with async await syntax in production. We have a debate whether if a new girl comes to our team, should we teach him or her this promise API, or should we just go with the async await? Because we don't have promises in our code. We promisify with async await. We write async await.
Okay, so that was a good question. Like, should new developers even learn how promises work? Optimally, no. And as someone who has a very, I'd like to think a very intimate experience with promises, I'd like users to not have to learn that. Obviously, it's always good to learn. Like every developer should know every aspect of the language because it's fun to learn and it's like important for personal development. But I'd hope that like in other languages that have promises and async await, like C#, you wouldn't have to do that. So for example, in C# you have async await, but you don't need to learn how tasks with task completion sources and all that work. One more question. We have time. Last one.
You said about the postmodern problem with the native promises in Node. Can you exactly explain more about it? Why cannot see in the jump?
Okay. So let's look at an example. Let's say I have this code.
What was the question?
Yeah. Okay. So the question was if I can elaborate a little bit about postmodern debugging in Node. And why promises sort of have a problem with that. So let's say I have this function, and I have a throw error here. When would I like the core dump? I'd like the core dump to be in this frame when I'm inside the then function. I'd like to have a state of the heap and the stack when the function through and not a microtick after that. Now, I can add the catch handler later to that function, and then it would be handled. And I can take a core dump whenever something like this might happen, because then I'd have a lot of core dumps, and those are expensive. It can take seconds or even minutes. Now, currently, Node will give you a hook to do this after a microtick. That means when this through, you can have a hook that will know when this through, and you'll be able to get most of the heap, but not all of it, because some things, if you through here and then you have a process.next tick that does something like the line after, you will get the. I'm just gonna write like a line of code and then I'm gonna finish, because it's an important problem. So let's see if my Visual Studio Code is set to the correct theme, and just 1 second. So let's do. And let's do language, let's do theme. I'm going to change to the light theme. Okay. And then I'm going to go here and I'm going to set to JavaScript, language mode, right? JavaScript. It's not, OMH. Okay. So let's say I have something like this. So promise. So I'm creating an empty promise here, and then I'm doing throw new error. And let's say I have a var stage of equals 0. So I'm doing a Dan Abramov thing where the state is 0, and I want to add.
You have too many R's in error.
You have too many errors in error. It would get this. I think this would work actually. It will still throw an error. So I do and process.next tick state plus plus, and then process.on unhandled rejection. E goes to throw E. Okay, so let's look at this case. So the question was about the postmodern problem, and I'm not sure. So let's do this. Okay, so I create a promise here, and I set the state to 1. Now, if I take a core dump, I want that core dump to say the state is 1. But in this case, the core dump will say the state is 2, because this only executes after this executed, because the promise can be handled later. I can actually even do something like this, where I let's do no. And then I can do so in this example, I'm handling the promise asynchronously. So it can't throw here because I'm still handling it here. So it can throw a priori, and it can't. So I can't get the core dump. And if this line is here, I get like this shouldn't happen because I'm handling the promise. And if this line isn't here, I'm getting a bad core dump. So that's in principle the problem with core dumps in promises. Okay, that's all the time I have. And just a second, I'll go to the end. Woo. Thank you.